has been widespread speculation that the Attorney General was preparing to do exactly that with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu due to a conflict of interest between these reforms and the Prime Minister's ongoing trial for alleged corruption. The procedure for the passage of these bills in the Knesset is marked by 3 readings of the bill or 3 votes. Critics say the proposed legislation is being rushed through so that it can be finalized into law by the close of the Knesset summer session on the 30th of July. They also fear that Netanyahu wants to leverage the judicial push to freeze or cancel his own trial, an accusation the Prime Minister denies. Then there are the critical factors. The ruling coalition in Israel views the judiciary as a left-leaning obstacle to its legislative agenda. Netanyahu's government has claimed that Israelis have lost faith in the legal system and that his reform plans would restore power to elected representatives instead of interventionist and unelected judges. Reports say the government seeks to use this power to override the Supreme Court to get rid of rulings outlawing Israeli outposts on private Palestinian land, for instance, and curtailing social reforms, including those impacting the LGBTQ community. Critics argue that these judicial reforms will give the legislature unbridled powers and make it immune from any system of checks and balances. The question is this: is it only a matter of time before these bills are signed into law? What will such a law mean for Israel's judiciary and its society? Will it mean the end of all judicial oversight for the far-right ruling coalition and with it the government's accountability? Will such a law impinge on civil liberties? Will it take Israel on the path of unchecked authoritarianism? Could another fallout be a far worsening of the Israel-Palestine conflict? Also, faced with unprecedented protests, what does this political challenge mean for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government? All right, we have a terrific panel of experts from Israel who will put this issue into perspective for us. Professor Yaniv Roznai, let me start with you. Sir, why is there so much anger on the streets of Israel over these proposed laws? Why do critics believe that these laws are downright dangerous? Will it be the end of all judicial oversight for Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling coalition? Will it be the end of government's accountability?
I think that the people are angry because what the government has put forward is the most extreme package of reforms. And that is, I think, the main problem. The government has chosen the most extreme reforms possible in every aspect. So limiting judicial review, only a supermajority of judges would be able to declare a law unconstitutional, which would in a way make judicial review ineffective. Abolishing judicial review of basic laws, something like the Indian basic structure doctrine, just that in Israel, a basic law can be enacted just in an ordinary law with a simple majority in a single day. Capturing the court by replacing the judges and allowing the coalition to appoint its own judges. All this together accumulatively would simply mean that the coalition, that the governing coalition, has almost absolute powers. Now, the big problem is that anyway, the starting point of Israeli constitutional order is in any way relatively weak compared to other countries. We, as you know, we do not have any rigid constitution or a rigid Bill of Rights. We do not have 2 houses in parliament. We are not a federal country. We are not subordinated to any supranational institution or a court. And accordingly, anyway, the executive, the cabinet, the government has already quite a lot of powers because it controls the legislature, the parliament. And in this setting, any change whatsoever now that would provide more power to the to the executive on the expense of the judiciary would put Israeli democracy at risk. And that is the big problem, I think, and that is why people are so afraid and angry.
Well, that is what is making people angry, but what really is the way forward? Gil Hoffman, let me ask you a couple of questions. Number one, are these reforms going to inevitably become a law? Is it now only a matter of time? Is the writing on the wall? Number one. Number two, there are many who argue that Netanyahu wants to leverage this law to freeze or cancel his own trial in his corruption cases. Of course, it's an accusation that the Prime Minister has denied. Also, correct me if I'm wrong, one controversial reform has already become a law. It removes the power of the Attorney General to pronounce a sitting Prime Minister unfit for office, and there is widespread speculation in Israel that the Attorney General was going to actually use this law against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you agree with that?
Neha, so what you say in your background is correct, but we need to put this into proportion. At the beginning, in January, 6 months ago, the Justice Minister proposed many far-reaching bills, and the only one that's been passed into law is that one about declaring a prime minister incapacitated. And now, at best, they're going to try to pass one more law by the Knesset recess beginning at the end of this month. And then there's a 3-month recess. We're already then into the second year after the election. What governments in Israel don't do in their first year, they tend to not get accomplished at all. So after reports that there would be such a sweeping revolution, Netanyahu lost. He wanted to do a lot of things. He wanted perhaps to impact his trial. He can't. It's not happening. The protesters already won. And at some point during that recess, there's going to be more negotiations and compromises. It's not going to be one side forcing down the throat of the other. No side is going to get completely what they want. That's the way it works in democracy.
All right. But, even though you say that the protesters have won, but Professor Avi Bill, let me bring you in here. Have the protesters really won? Because if you go by the attitude of the Prime Minister and his coalition of far-right leaders and political parties, it is very clear that they're determined to ramrod this legislation through the Knesset. In fact, it is being said that they want to ensure that this proposed that this bill is signed into law by the 30th of July, before the end of the summer session of the Knesset. And therefore, the question that arises is, are they really paying any attention to the protesters? How do you see this as a political challenge to Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right government?
The movement for judicial reform didn't begin 6 months ago, and it didn't begin with the elections. It's been going on since the Supreme Court and then the legal advisors to the government began systematically seizing for themselves absolute unreviewable powers contrary to the law. So, for example, you said there's legal authority for the legal advisor to declare the prime minister incapacitated. There's no such law. There's no such authority. The legal advisor had threatened to do so, notwithstanding the fact that there's no legal authority. Now, steps like this, the seizure of unlimited power by the Supreme Court and by the legal advisors, has gradually eroded faith among the Israeli public in these institutions. It used to be that the Supreme Court was widely trusted by more than 80% of the public. Now it's distrusted by most of the Israeli public. Nearly 90% distrust the legal advisors. There is going to be some change. And I think that it's precisely because this government is listening to the majority of the Israeli public that wants to restore parliamentary democracy, to restore checks and balances, to restore separation of powers, to return the executive authority to the executive, to return the parliamentary authority to the parliament, and leave the judiciary intact as one of the strongest judiciaries in the world, but this time without executive and parliamentary authority.
Okay, it's interesting. You say that this government is listening to the people of Israel. But if it was really listening to the people of Israel, why would tens of thousands of people be taking to the streets? We've seen these protests since the month of January, and the latest protests erupted as recently as over the weekend in Tel Aviv, ahead of the first reading on this bill in the Knesset. Also, you say that, the government wants to restore checks and balances. The biggest fear that's been expressed by the critics is that it takes away all checks and balances. But my job is just to play the devil's advocate. So, Professor Yaniv Roznai, these are the two sides of this debate. The government and its supporters say that Israelis have lost faith in the legal and judicial system. That is an argument that's being advanced by Professor Avi Bell as well. And therefore, these reform plans would restore power to the elected representatives who represent the will of the people instead of quote-unquote interventionist and unelected judges. On the other hand, those who are bitterly opposed to these reforms say that these legislations will give the government unbridled powers and make it completely immune from any system of checks and balances. How does one view this issue?
Yes, it is indeed a very complicated issue. I want to refer perhaps at the beginning to one point. It is true that the public confidence in the judiciary has been decreasing in the last 30 years or so. But one must be honest and say that the public trust or confidence in the political branches is much lower than the public trust in the judiciary, which is almost as in other countries. So I'm not very sure how politicizing the judiciary would increase public trust or confidence in the court. Just the opposite, I believe. And I'm also not so sure that the government is listening to the people. In all the recent surveys in the last 6 months, a vast majority of Israelis oppose this judicial overhaul. Now, what is most frustrating for me as a law professor, it is quite easily to reach a compromise, a consensus reform, a good reform for Israel. But it's not this reform. It is not this reform because this is not a reform. Reforming is improving, creating something that is better and not destroying the system. And unfortunately, this is very much what's going to happen if this so-called reform passes. And I've heard before that it was said that as if the protest has won and the government is posing with the legislation. But no, this is not the case. The government simply changes tactic. From a one big blitz, a whole package of the reform, they are simply changing to a more incremental process, piece by piece. But when we see around the world what's going on and how democracies are eroded, it is precisely through this incremental process. And this is why we are still very much afraid about this process.